US, in China, or somewhere else. And then I found the program here, actually theology, pastoral theology. It's much cheaper than the US, the course in US. So I continue my study here. And I kind of like Toulouse. It's one thing it's like I like it so much is that I don't have to drive. I can get around with transportation, public transportation. So, yeah.
It's good of you to zoom in.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I'm relieved to hear that you're relatively new to the French language, because the little bit of French that I'll use today is not going to be pronounced too authentically, I'm afraid. So if you were born and raised in France, I might have felt more nervous.
No. I'm still struggling with my French, even though I'm taking the course. Sort of like I kind of like jump ahead. But it's good.
My French is 60 years old, so 3 years of high school French isn't going to help.
That's right. I'll only be using a few names, which I'll pronounce with a nice American accent.
Father, what parish are you in? Where are you assigned?
I'm not assigned to a parish. I'm assigned to the province staff in New York.
Okay.
But I visit a lot of parishes. I'm finally able to start visiting parishes in person, which I couldn't do all of last year.
Oh, great.
And at the moment, this afternoon, I'm Zooming with you from St. Aidan's Parish in Jersey City, New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful.
Is the St. Peter's University Parish Church.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
St.
okay.
Peter's, right.
Yes.
Well, none of us could go well, in fact, we couldn't even go to church. So
Yeah.
all of us were kind of stuck.
Right. That's right. I still haven't met even Dee in person. It's only been by Zoom and telephone.
Oh, well, you just only got 2 dimensions of her. She's got many more dimensions when you meet her in person.
How was your daughter feeling, Dee?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You got to speak to the mic.
How was your daughter feeling?
She is, she's recovering. She's gonna have she's much better than she was. She's certainly out of any kind of danger, but she's just gonna have a very long, slow recovery. The doctor said to expect it to take at least a year for her to fully recover.
Oh, my.
So, but thank you. She's doing much better.
Wonderful. Glad to hear it.
Okay, we have Carol joining us now.
It only occurs to me right now that we're competing with the NFL.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's why I don't know if you heard, but I turned the recording on. We have quite a few folks that go in and watch the recordings, because Sunday afternoon was difficult for them to make the actual presentation, but you will be seen probably by about 70 or 80 people
Oh, wow.
before all is done.
That's great. You're getting good involvement.
Yeah. So I guess we can begin anytime you'd like.
Okay, very good. Everybody, my name is Father Tom Benz. I'm a native of Buffalo, New York, a graduate of Georgetown University. I've been a Jesuit for 32 years, a priest for 21. Most recently, I was assigned to the mission in Micronesia and the Pacific Islands, where most of the islands are still COVID-free, I would like to mention.
Oh, good.
But I left a COVID-free island in August of 2020 and moved to New York City.
Oh, goodness. From the into the fire, huh?
This is what we call holy obedience. In the Society of Jesus. And that's when, as Dee mentioned, I took this position as a provincial's assistant for pastoral ministries. So I try to support all the work of the parishes. We have 18 parishes like yours up and down the East Coast. And also a few hospital and prison chaplains fall under my bailiwick, as do the international missions, which are basically for us now, Micronesia and Fiji. So as Dee was alluding to earlier, when I heard about the series, I thought it was a great idea to look at your windows in a little bit more depth. And I did volunteer for St. Isaac Jogues, because during my days in Micronesia, Isaac Jogues was a good patron of mine. And I usually took about 60 airline flights a year there. And I always prayed to Jogues beforehand for safe passage. So I will say this, though, before I give you a little bit of his own history, and I want to talk about a couple of places, since this is one of the people in your windows who actually walked the earth of North America, unlike most of them, a couple of places that you might even visit someday. A little bit of my own background with him, and a little bit of background too in terms of French spirituality from his era and how that affected him and other Jesuits and plenty of other people, to set the stage for just how it was he tried to live out his vocation as a missionary, which was very distinct for him. Well, how many of you have seen the movie Black Robe? It came out in 1991.
No, I think it's a dim memory, but I believe I did see it. Yeah.
Based on a book by Brian Moore, which came out a few years earlier. And the Black Robes, of course, that was the name given to the Jesuits in their missionary work because they literally wore black robes. And in North America, that's how they became known really across the whole continent. The
That's
movies,
because the Franciscans wore brown robes. No, they were the other major missionary group in North America.
yes, and as a
South
matter
Wales.
of fact, the Franciscan Recollect Fathers are the ones who created the mission in New France, although the Jesuits came after them and were the ones who in fact were martyred, like Isaac Jogues. The movie is actually historical fiction, but it's very interesting and very accurate. And there's sort of different pieces of some of the actual historical Jesuits stories that are worked in one way or another into the historical novel. And of course, they filmed it in the right places in North America. So the scenery is both authentic and quite striking. The movie does have a little bit of brutal violence in it, and a sex scene that makes it R-rated as well. So I couldn't always show the whole movie in the high school when I was teaching. But on the whole, it's certainly worth seeing, and it focuses on one young Jesuit in particular, who's a fictional character, but who embodies a lot of the spirit and the dilemma and the courage of the people that we talk about when we celebrate the North American martyrs. And of course, the feast day in this country is on October 19th in a couple of days. In Canada, they celebrated it at the end of September. I'll explain a little bit why we use the October dates in a little while. So you have to go back now almost 4 centuries to the time of Jogues and these other North American martyrs, into an uncharted land, a land now that has been well settled and paved and delineated with political boundaries and towns and cities and all those things. And you have to strip those things away in your mind and just imagine the Mohawk River and the St. Lawrence River, more or less unadulterated. There would have been some population traveling there, but they would have been Algonquin Indians, Huron Indians, known as the Wendat people, and Mohawks, and other members of the Iroquois Confederation. We like to talk about it, we kid among the Jesuits about the New York Jesuit martyrs and the Canadian Jesuit martyrs, because Jogues and 2 others died in what's now New York State. The other 5 died in what's now Canada. So we tussle over that. And in our novitiate in Syracuse, New York, where there are also windows of Isaac Jogues and the ones who died in New York, as well as Katieri Tekakwitha, that chapel is called the Chapel of the Jesuit Martyrs of New York State. Which is historically accurate, but it's a little bit of a jab, I think, at the Canadian rivalry. Now, I'm looking at your window, and I'm thinking of the one that's back in the novitiate in Syracuse, New York, of Isaac Jogues, and they're actually quite different. The black robe is the same, as you might expect. The fact that he's holding up a cross is also the same. But to be honest, your window in Woodstock is a little bit cleaner than that one. By which I mean this. Often in iconography, Isaac Jogues is depicted with a hatchet wound in his forehead,
Oh my God.
and also with mutilated hands, because he suffered tortures on more than one occasion that made it impossible for him, canonically speaking, to say Mass because his hands were so badly mangled by the tortures he endured. Well, let me say a little bit more about the context in France of that era, just to give you a sense of where people are coming from. So he's not a missionary martyr of the 3rd or 4th century. He's not a missionary martyr of Africa or Asia. He's in North America in basically a new French territory, a place where French are exploring, but it's also very new to them. And so the encounter between the native peoples that I was mentioning before and the French is all still very new and very raw, if you will, and pretty complicated at the same time. So why does a young man from Orléans in France end up there and in this situation? Well, much more so than today. French, of course, was a very Catholic country at that time. And Jogues, soon after his education, enlisted in the Jesuit novitiate. He was ordained at 29 years old in 1636, which incidentally is just a little bit after the Ark and the Dove sail into your neighborhood in the state of Maryland. So it's roughly what's going on there, but there's not a lot of contact, of course, between the English explorers and the French ones. So he's ordained at 29 and he's assigned immediately to the Huron mission in Canada, which was his request. Now, lest we think that all the native peoples are of one culture or one mind, a little bit of background there. The Huron people were not part of the Iroquois Confederation. They lived primarily in what we would now call Ontario and Quebec. Most of the Iroquois Confederation would have lived in what we call New York State today. And there was a certain amount of tension between them. The Algonquin people near the Huron and the Huron or Wendat people tended to be more sedentary and more peaceable. And the Iroquois Confederation tended to be more warlike. And within the Iroquois Confederation, there's a fair amount of distinction there. And as we'll see in this story, the Mohawk tribe within the Iroquois Confederation are probably the ones most prone to violence. And obviously in this story are most pertinent for our purposes. So once Jogues arrives in France, he takes in New France, I should say, he takes an 800-mile journey over the course of 19 days, mostly by waterways, connecting rivers through what we'd call Southern Ontario and the province of Quebec, oftentimes having to get out of the canoe and carry the canoe around rapids or other obstacles. But it's on that journey into the inland of New France where he gets his nickname from the Huron companions that he's with. And he came to be known among them, and then eventually among the Mohawk and others, as Ondasonk. Ondasonk is his Huron name. It means bird of prey. It wasn't uncommon for the native people to give a name like that to one of the foreigners. Jean de Brebeuf, one of the other North American martyrs, had been given the nickname Échan, which means the one who carries the heavy load. Brebeuf was a very big man, and he could, when they were carrying canoes around rapids and so on, he could really pull his weight and other weight as well. So that's the reason for his nickname. What I've not been able to find out is just why they called Isaac Jogues bird of prey. Not too long after he meets the Huron people, there's a smallpox epidemic among the Huron. And in lack of other explanation, the black robes get blamed for that. It clears up, but he's always aware of the threat of violence because that had been threatened during that period of time. He's always aware, as the missionaries are, of the threat of violence here. And this is where I'll pause to talk a little bit about that school of French spirituality of the 17th century. If you know names like Saint John Eudes or Saint Vincent de Paul, they would be considered founders of this French school of spirituality of the 17th century. And some of the other followers in that school would be Saint Louis de Montfort, Saint John Baptiste de la Salle. And there's a few traits that are nothing brand new in Christianity at the time, but they're sort of, this is how the package at the time and their own age is emphasizing elements of Christianity. First of all, there's a great attention to mystical experiences of prayer. There's a great sense of adoration of the divine, of the grandeur of God in a transcendent sense. And at the same time, there's a real focus on the incarnation of Jesus. And relationship with Jesus himself is something that they're cultivating very actively, along with contemplation of the mysteries of Mary's life as well, which is, for example, why you see so many rosaries in the iconography here as well. And the rosary would have been a daily companion to all of these people and to the Hurons that they were sharing Christianity with. Mortifications are also a trait of this French school of spirituality. Now, it's also the era of Jansenism, particularly in France, which some people summarize this way as the harder it is, the holier it is. And so I want to mortify myself by fasting, sacrifices, devices that I wear on my body that pinch into me a little bit more just to create some more sort of suffering in me. Now, Jansenism, of course, is something that we don't want to lean into because it tends to emphasize this idea somehow that harder is holier, but also that I'm in charge of what's holy and I control that in some ways. But there is some flavor of it within this French school of spirituality. So people like these Jesuits and others at the time who were going abroad, they're not only not afraid of suffering, they rather welcome it. Not as necessarily masochism, but as devotion to the one who suffered before them. It's connected to this notion of a deep relationship with Jesus. Now, in our own culture, we've tended to shy a little bit more from those things. And I wouldn't encourage people to go looking for, ways to make themselves suffer. But the basic premise of being united in suffering with Christ, of course, is a thoroughly Christian notion. And the last trait I want to mention for this French school of spirituality is their real sense of missionary zeal. And a lot of people took even private vows of service of one sort or another. So even though these vowed Jesuits go to New France, some of them take particular vows to stay. Noel Chabanel, for example, one of the other North American martyrs, was terrible with the local languages. He had the hardest time of any of them learning any Huron or Algonquin language. So he made a vow to stay. It would have been rather reasonable for him not to become a lifelong missionary there. But in that French school of spirituality, with that sense of going for what's tougher, if you will, but also embracing the missionary opportunity and even being willing to suffer, that's a sort of private vow that he adds in his own story. So I want to get us quickly through the story then of Jogues, update you some more about geography. And I want to focus on a place called Sainte Marie, what's in Ontario today in the city of Midland, and then Auriesville, New York today, which was known as Osserninan, a Mohawk village where Katieri Tekakwitha was born. Now, as I look at your window again, I had to ask myself right away, is the girl up front, the native girl, is that Katieri Tekakwitha? I'm not sure that it is, for a couple of reasons. The first one is that she was born 10 years after Jogues died. I think the reason there's a child there with the rosary is that Jogues and the others really made an effort to teach the children in the villages. And as we'll see in just a minute, that's what got René Goupil, one of Jogues's companions, into hot water in that Mohawk village in Osarnina. Jogues had gone first to Ste. Marie. That was the center of the Jesuit mission in what we call Ontario. It's about an hour and a half west of Toronto today. And it was set up as this ideal little Christian settlement with farming and fishing and animal husbandry and so on. Some of the Huron people who had come in to live there in the settlement or who used it as kind of a base where they would come and gather. And the Jesuits themselves used it as a base from which to go out to further missions. And men who were out like Chabanel or Garnier in farther away places would come back for a period of rest, of retreat, of nourishment, and of Jesuit companionship before going back out on solo missions often again. In 1642, Jogues takes a trip from Ste. Marie, and he goes back to Quebec City, which is the center of the entire French settlement as well as the French mission. But on his way back, he's captured by Mohawk Indians who have invaded to the north. And that's his first experience really of captivity and torture, of several of these experiences. And on that occasion, they bit out his fingernails and chewed up his fingers. And that began the mangling of his hands, which I'll say some more about in a little while. One of his goals in going to Quebec was to find a companion. And he did come back with a companion who was a young man who had not stayed in the Jesuit novitiate in France because of his own ill health. But he had some training in medicine, and he came to New France as what we call a donné, a lay associate is how we might phrase that today. And he was committed to working with the Jesuits. So Jogues and Goupil are on their way back to Ste. Marie when they're captured and then tortured. And in fact, they don't get back to Ste. Marie. They're taken southeast along what we call the Mohawk River to this village of Osarninan, which is a palisaded village of the Mohawks. It's about a half an hour from today's Albany, New York. Amsterdam, New York is the nearest town. And obviously they're in much greater danger now. There's a general threat of danger from their point of view. Now they're actually captives of a hostile tribe, a tribe that's also violent against the people that they've been evangelizing directly, the Hurons. So they're in a precarious position. They're forced to run the gauntlet when they get to the village. There, Jogues' left thumb is cut off with a jagged shell. They're subject to torture by hot coals. And in the desperation of the situation, recognizing that they may not survive, René Goupil specifically asks Isaac Jogues, is it still possible for me to become a Jesuit? And so Jogues, it's not so easy nowadays to get into the order, let me tell you. But Jogues accepts him on behalf of the order as a coadjutor brother, a brother of the same status as would have been St. Alphonsus Rodriguez, your patron. Well, I alluded before to the emphasis on educating the children, and not long after their capture and their torture, Goupil makes the sign of the cross on the head of a Mohawk child. He's tomahawked to death as a result. September 29th, 1642. And Jogues was right there, and Jogues fell to his knees and thought he was going to get the hatchet next. But he didn't. One of my favorite places in the story of Isaac Jogues is at the shrine today at Orisville, New York. And there's a great big circular Coliseum, they call it, with 72 doors and so on. There used to be a Jesuit retreat house there. The grounds are great to walk in because they talk about Isaac Jogues seeing the forest as his chapel during that time in captivity in that village. But if you just cross what's now across the street from there, which is just a simple paved road, you can walk today down into the ravine. And the ravine to me is especially holy ground at Orisville, because the ravine is where the body of Goupil was tossed aside after he was killed. And Jogues escaped late at night and went down into the ravine and dragged Goupil's body to the river and weighted it down with stones so that he could come back another time to give it a proper burial. When he eventually was able to get back, he's sort of in a house captivity, so he has a little bit of freedom within the village to move sometimes. When he finally is able to come back down to the ravine, though, there's no trace of Goupil's remains. And he was never able to solve exactly what happened there, whether animals had gotten to the body, whether Mohawks had found it. It's unclear. Today, though, they've created what's almost like Stations of the Cross as you go down into the ravine, walking along the road. There's about 12 or 14 stations, and it's excerpts from the account Isaac Jogues wrote about the death of René Goupil. It's not the Good Friday story exactly, but it's very similar in its tone. And so it's really a prayerful experience to walk down there gradually, as if you're walking with Isaac Jogues, mourning René Goupil. And then you come to a space down below that's an open field at the base of the ravine, where they've made a chapel and so on. And it's particularly holy ground if you're ever able to travel there. I'd really encourage it. Well, let me fast forward a little bit. Jogues doesn't die then with Goupil in 1642. He lives another several years. And he doesn't end up all in one place. Ultimately, the Mohawks take him to Fort Orange, which is the Dutch settlement, Albany, New York. He's ransomed by the Dutch and smuggled out to New Amsterdam, New York City, and gets back to Europe. Now, once he's back in Europe, they had heard a lot about his story, and he's kind of received like a hero, but he's eager to go back. The immediate story that is relevant in Europe is this: his hands were so badly mutilated that he was not allowed to celebrate the Eucharist by canon law. These are your canonical digits. A priest has to have these 4 fingers intact in order to do it. Well, the Jesuits petitioned Pope Urban VIII for an exception to the rule here, and Urban VIII granted it. And the famous phrase of Urban VIII was this: it would be shameful that a martyr of Christ not be allowed to drink the blood of Christ. So there was a papal indult that allowed him to go back to saying Mass. In 1644, then he visits his mother in Orleans, and then he returns to New France in short order. And he ends up a sort of diplomat. All of a sudden, there's a peace conference being negotiated between the French and the Iroquois Federation. And all of a sudden, Jogues becomes the envoy of the French to go to the Mohawks specifically now to get their approval. There's 5 and later 6 tribes in the Iroquois nation. The Mohawks were not at the peace negotiation, but they had to approve it for it to be valid. So he becomes the ambassador. And the Mohawks back at Osserninan are floored. They don't believe that this former slave of theirs, for whom they accepted a ransom, is now coming back as a government official of sorts for the French. So he functions in that way, and they receive him back again. And he's now got a companion with him who's a layman, who doesn't become a Jesuit, who's a young man named John de Lalande. But not everybody's willing to observe diplomatic immunity with, if you will, or diplomatic safe passage. And the Mohawks haven't bought into that peace agreement. And so there's another outbreak of violence there. Some of the Hurons who are accompanying Jogues and Lalande flee. And so there's only one Huron guide with Jogues and Lalande when they're finally taken prisoner again by the Mohawks. It's October 17th when they're brought back to Osserninan in the year 1646. And within a couple of days, both Lalande and Jogues are dead. On October 18th, Jogues finally does receive a tomahawk hatchet, and then the following day, Jean de Lalande. And their heads are posted on the palisades around the village, and their bodies are thrown into the Mohawk River. So it's a brutal and bloody kind of ending for them. Another thing that's very important for me personally in the story is this. I'm reminded of it because of the shrine today at Auriesville and the ravine there. If you go to the area at the shrine above the ravine, all the trees have the name Jesus carved into the wood, into the bark of the tree. And that's something that Katieri Tekakwitha would have seen as a girl in that village, because Isaac Jogues and Jean de Lalande and the others made those carvings. And I mentioned before the French school's real focus on a nearness to Jesus. That was one way for them to not just educate, but to pray, was by always focusing on the name of Jesus. And back in 1642, when they were in threat and first captured, Goupil and Isaac Jogues had made an agreement among themselves that they would end every day by repeating the name of Jesus, just in case they didn't survive the night. They wanted the last word on their lips to be the name of Jesus. And oftentimes they said it in triplicate, if you will, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And that is recounted again in that story of Isaac Jogues when he wrote about Goupil's death. And that's in those stations that take you down the ravine where Goupil's body was left and then disappeared. So something I would encourage you to think about as you talk about the patronage of Isaac Jogues, especially this week as we celebrate the feast, is just that commitment that all of this story, the desire to go and spread the gospel, the willingness to suffer and even to die, this desire to save souls and to share the name of Jesus. A very simple way you might focus on that is just yourself repeating the name Jesus a few times as a mantra for meditation, and simply allow it to be not a theological exercise as much as an occasion of presence between yourself and the Lord. In the long run, if you ever have the chance to go visit either Midland, Ontario or Auriesville, New York, I'd encourage you. You have some Jesuit Martyrs sites right on this continent. Now, to be honest with you, the Canadian government has taken charge of the site up in Canada. And so there's a lot of funding, and there's a really great visitor experience and a visitor center and all of that. It's much simpler at Auriesville. But I do have a personal stake at Auriesville, aside from it being in New York. It's also where our Jesuit cemetery is, the one where I anticipate someday I'll be buried. So Isaac Jogues goes as a good patron of mine. The last thing I'll mention on that front is the very first time I heard of Isaac Jogues. I think I was 9 or 10 years old, and my family took a vacation in New York State in midsummer. And I call it and I have 3 brothers. You have to understand, it's all boys in the house. So we called it the All-American Catholic Boys Vacation that summer because we went to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. And then we went to Howe Caverns. It's a great experience when you're 10 to be 75 feet underground in natural pitch darkness on a little boat sailing through, learning what stalactites and stalagmites are. And then we went to Auriesville to the shrine. And that's the first time I heard of Jesuits or Isaac Jogues or any of these things. None of my family, of course, had any idea that I'd be asking them one day to visit my grave there. So there's a lot to the Isaac Jogues story. In the window that you have, I can make out 8 halos, which I think represents all 8 North American martyrs, although you can't even see 8 faces, but clearly you've got him up front. And having learned from you that the windows were originally at Woodstock College makes even more sense to me. These martyrs were only canonized in 1930, almost 300 years after they were killed. But Jogues was a particular favorite in the United States by then. And the novitiate of the Maryland province, where people like Father Joe Lacey and many of the other presenters that you have met this week did their novitiate, was at Warnersville, Pennsylvania. And it was intended to be called St. Stanislaus Novitiate because Stanislaus Kostka is the patron of Jesuit novices worldwide. But Isaac Jogues and the others were in the air at that time because They were just about to be canonized and so on. So there was called the novitiate of St. Isaac Jogues. I'm guessing Father O'Donnell even made his novitiate there.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
All right, you've been really attentive. Thanks very much. I appreciate the chance to talk about a good friend of mine, a Jesuit who went before me. If you have some questions, I'd give it a stab.
If you have questions, check and make sure you're not muted, because I was muting some folks when there was background noise.
Kathleen.
In I guess it was 1984, my husband and I did a road trip the Northeast, and we did go to Ariesville, New York, and my husband wasn't Catholic, number one. And so he couldn't understand why I wanted to go there, but you know, I had my AAA travel guide. So I said, no, I want to go there. And so we went to it, and it is a very interesting place. And as you said, and so then I had to explain about the Jesuit Martyrs, right?
Mhm.
I mean, Larry was familiar with Jesuits since, despite not being Catholic, he ended up going to Loyola College here in Baltimore.
Okay.
Now Loyola something university, but name changes. But so he was familiar with Jesuits, and of course, he loved them. So
What do you remember from your visit there?
well, first of all, I remember you brought back a lot of memories. We were very thorough. We did everything, and I remember the trail with the signs on the trees,
Mhm.
and the Jesus carved into the tree bark and going down, and it was quite an we also I don't think I did the Canadian part, but even the New York part was quite extensive, and you got a real, and you know what, we bought little pamphlets also that explained, you know, all the trials and the tortures of the martyrs and whatever. And it was but even just going through doing a little self tour, you know, you got the whole idea of what happened to Saint Isaac and all of the different martyrs, and Saint Katieri, and even a little bit about Saint Katieri. So and I think there's also a Mohawk longhouse there, so longhouse, not log house. So you can see how the Indian, what the Indian residences were like, and they had even, I think they had an Indian village, a mock-up of a Mohawk village, so that you could see what the communal life of the Mohawk Indians was. So it was, you know, if anybody goes up that way, they really should stop in and take a look. And it's very informative and interesting on many levels, not just the religious level, but just to see. And there's I think there's a part of a fort, a French Canadian fort there, and it really is very, very interesting, as I said, on many dimensions. So
You're reminding me too that the mission itself is short-lived, really.
yeah.
The Canadian site up in Midland, Ontario, they feature basically a 10-year period when that settlement at Sainte Marie among the Huron was a thriving settlement and Christian community. But not long after Brebeuf died, which was 3 years after Jogues, that settlement was entirely wiped out and burned to the ground. And some of the Huron Christians moved west and a few moved to Quebec. But it's not as though Christianity flourished right away. It was quite a long time before more of the local people became Christian in great numbers. But as Irenaeus said, the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians. And so all these years later, we're finding the evangelical power of the mission of Isaac Jogues long after his death.
So
Who are all-
go ahead, Carol.
No, I was going to say, again, tell me, who are these men that surround him? Were they his recruitment or followers? Who were they that I see in this window?
There are a total of 8 North American martyrs who were Jesuits. And so that's why I think I can pick out 8 halos. You can really only make out 5 faces of the Jesuits in this window.
Right.
The most famous besides Jogues would be Saint Jean de Brebeuf, who was the great one, Échan, who could carry his weight when they were traveling through the rivers. He and Jogues are the 2 that are most often highlighted by name on the feast. The others were all French Jesuits who came some for a lengthy time, some had only been there a brief time when they were killed. They all died between 1642 and 1649.
Mm.
And they would have known each other and traveled in and out of the same places and so on. And there were probably a couple dozen more Jesuits in the mission. The only other names that I know would include Simon Lemoyne. He did not die a martyr, but we have a college named after him in Syracuse, New York.
Mhm.
And the Jesuits at Syracuse, New York, as a matter of fact, have done quite a lot in the last 10 or 15 years of conversation with the descendants of the Algonquin, Huron, Mohawk peoples, the Haudenosaunee tribe of the Iroquois Federation in particular, to sort of talk about past relations and problems and future and so on.
So assuming that, and I'm, this is just an assumption on my part, that there would have been various villages of Mohawk, not everybody living in one spot. It's pretty certain that the ones that captured him the second time were the same people that he would have been in contact with the first time?
Yes, but within the village, there are even different clans in the Mohawk setup. So the Wolf Clan, the Bear Clan, the Turtle Clan, and so on. I believe it was members of the Wolf Clan when he was first brought back the second time who were able to take him in and protect him. But it was members of the Bear Clan within the same village who ultimately killed him.
Okay.
So it's not, like many communities, the Mohawk village was not a monolith either.
Mhm. But he would have more or less been known kind of nationwide among the Mohawk?
Yes, and news did travel somehow or another. People knew reputations very well. He had also left behind in the village, the first time he was there when Goupil died, he had left behind a chest that was full of vestments and chalices and other religious goods and books and things, because he really did intend to come back there to continue his mission at some point. During the years he was away, there had been another epidemic, and there was a sense that superstition that this chest was somehow responsible, and this was the Black Robe who had left it behind. So even while he was not there, there was some malintent brewing against him.
The epidemic, wasn't that a smallpox epidemic, as I recall?
Yeah, I think you're right about that, yes.
Yeah.
And Katieri Tekakwitha, of course, herself a few years later, she was very badly marred by smallpox and nearly blinded by it. And some of her family had died of it too. So she was raised by people other than her. I think her mother and her sibling had died of it already. But you may know the story of Katieri's death. There was a Jesuit at her death, and the report when she died at 24, this is a little past Jogues' time, was that all of her smallpox marks
Disappeared.
vanished when she died. I won't rule it out.
So he was beheaded?
Jogues was beheaded. Yeah.
Beheaded. Okay, so, and then his body
was-
was thrown
Yeah.
away or whatever?
He first
Yeah.
got the hatchet, which probably killed him. And
Yeah,
then later he was beheaded. The head was put up on the fence, the palisade, and the body was tossed in the Mohawk River.
huh.
Wasn't recovered as far as I know.
Is there an area where he, like a grave site or something that marks where he died or anything like that?
There isn't. We
No?
just have a sense of where the bounds of the village were, and archaeologists will argue a little bit about those as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we know the general vicinity, but we don't really know the spot.
And what's the name of this city or whatever in New York?
Today, if you were to look it up online, you would go to Auriesville, New York. That's spelled A-U-R-I-E-S, Ville.
Okay,
The Mohawk name was also Ninan, and it's, I'd say 30 minutes from Albany. To the west.
It's a pretty part of the country.
Yeah, it's got beautiful foliage as you go
Yeah.
through there, spring, summer, or fall.
Yeah.
I might not direct you there in the winter just because you don't know what you're going to find.
yeah, true, yeah, yeah.
When Jesuits are buried there, people who've died during the winter, there's a little chapel at our cemetery, and oftentimes a few men will wait in the chapel until spring when they can be buried.
So there's a chapel there.
There's a tiny chapel at the cemetery.
Okay.
There's a large church called the Coliseum Church, which is a great big round church that used to receive pilgrims in the 50s, and they'd have 2,000 people in this great big round church. The train would come up from New York City and people would walk up the hill from the train station to this big Coliseum Church with 4 altars. So there'd be an altar in every direction. It's got a very native feel inside in terms of the interior architecture.
Mm.
It's a little bit old now and needs a lot of maintenance, and the pilgrimage train has dried up. There are bus trips that will go there still, but the numbers are way down. We now have things like NFL and Disney World. People focus their energy on more.
Who runs the shrine these days, Tom?
It's the diocese. Well, you know what? It's not the Diocese of Albany. It falls under the Diocese of Albany, but now there's an independent corporation of lay people
Oh,
who
oh,
have
yeah?
taken over. That just developed in the last several years.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no longer a Jesuit community there. I think it's been about a dozen years since there have been any Jesuits there. We had a retreat house there for about 30 years. And that building is on the edge of the property and was sold now. It's another use at this point.
Where you live now, how far away are you from this village?
I live in Brooklyn, which is about a 4-hour drive up
Oh,
to
okay.
Voorheesville.
Oh, okay.
So you can't just quite swing by.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
When I did my theology studies in Boston, I would go to visit family in Buffalo, and Voorheesville was about halfway between Boston and Buffalo. And so when I was making that route, I would stop. Now, I also had the privilege of going to these places with the novices. And we would have all the new Jesuit novices all get a good thorough education in the martyr's story, because they're our local boys, so to speak.
Yeah.
So they'd do some research, they'd make some presentations to the other novices, and then we'd take a half-a-day trip over to Voorheesville, but then we'd spend a weekend up in Midland, Ontario, where there's a much more extensive exhibition. So that's a good tradition builder for our younger men.
Dee, who was the Jesuit in our church who was going for his doctorate, and he was in New York, and he went back to
Vinod. There were
Oh,
several
yeah.
of them, but Vinod
Dr.
Fernandez from
yeah,
India.
Father Vinod.
He
Yeah.
would come to St. Alphonsus. He was a good friend of Father Joe's, Father Lacey's. And
I
when
see.
he was at Catholic U, he would, I think he was at Catholic, no, I think he was from Fordham. The two that went to Catholic
Yes.
U, Catholic U stayed with us. Father Innes,
Yes.
Inna, and I can't remember the other one right now.
You're
Yeah.
talking about the SVD, 2 SVD fathers?
Mhm.
Yeah. Inez. Wait, the other one, I think Inez.
I don't know.
No.
I can remember. Yeah.
They were from Taiwan. I mean, they were Indian, but they were from Taiwan, and they would spend some time in Taiwan and came to US to study.
Yeah.
By
We
Well,
used to
Father
call
Tom-
it, huh?
Go
Used
ahead,
to call-
Kathy.
We used to call it the Dewdrop Inn. It was a big house, and with lots of empty bedrooms, so we were constantly had interesting clergy that would show up walking around the grounds, and we said, oh, another guest.
We've kept most of those bedrooms with the renovation, Father Tom, so it's open to the Jesuits for retreats. A lot of them used to come, to do their retreats there, their week-long retreats or whatever.
Yeah.
So keep it in mind. Thank you so much for
Happy to do that.
signing on and
Yes.
this presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you
Yes,
very
it
much,
was.
Father.
Nice to spend some time with you all. I really appreciate it. You're troopers for listening to a Sunday afternoon lecture.
Yes.
I
Well,
hope
we're
there's
looking
something-
forward we're looking forward to coming and being with us in person.
Yes,
hopefully I'll be
anytime.
hoping That'll be in February or March.
Okay.
Oh,
Oh,
okay, good.
nice.
That's great.
And it'll be great to see you in person, because as I said before, I wasn't able to go anywhere last year at all.
Well, you're very welcome anytime.
I'll look forward to joining you, particularly for Sunday Mass.
Great.
Thank
Good.
you, Father.
Okay,
Thank you,
take care,
Father.
everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Everybody,
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Godspeed on the journey.
Thanks, Dee.
Good to see you, Tiff.
Thank you. Safe travels.
I hope I'll make it next week. I try to make it next week. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Glad to do it, Dee. It was a lot of fun for me. I hope it's good
Good.
for everybody there too. It's a
Good.
great series. I think this is a great innovation.
Yeah, I'm disappointed that we don't have more people sign on, but as I said, if you go in and check the numbers on the recordings, there are quite a few who watch the recordings.
Sure, sure. That's one of the advantages of this medium now is people don't have to be there live at the moment.
And if they
Right.
have any questions, too bad.
That's what they miss. That's what they miss. Kathleen, I really appreciated your more recent tour book of Voorheesville. That was great to have in the conversation.
Well, yeah, it was fun. Larry and I, we decided to just do a car trip throughout various places, in the Northeast, I guess. I went out to Canada and came back down. And I says, oh, well, why don't we, it was in the AAA book. Well, I said, oh, well, I knew about it at any rate. And my husband didn't, he wasn't, as I said, he wasn't Catholic, so he didn't know all this stuff. But he found it fascinating. So
Did you also stop in Fonda, New York, which is a half an hour away? That's the birthplace of Katieri.
I think we did.
Yeah.
Because when we got there, there was some, they said where it was. And so we said, well, maybe we could just kind of scoot up there and come back, because there was a lot about her and her mother, and the difficult time she had and the fact that she had smallpox and whatever. And the fact that her mother was a Christian, living among non-Christian Indians and whatever. Of course, they had a deal where they would, I guess it was a hostage deal where the tribes would get hostages from other tribes for whatever reason. I don't remember the details anymore, but sometimes it was a matter of a bride price, or they would steal young people who would go out to forage for berries or whatever, and another tribe would kidnap them and take them back, and sometimes they would stay with the tribe and get married off to a chief or whatever. And that was the situation with Katieri's mother. Her mother was not a member of the tribe, but her father was, and so it was kind of interesting to see the customs of the Native Americans at that time, and how she got to be where she was. And I think the fact that she had the smallpox, they felt was kind of a curse, because of something her mother had done, or it was a mismatch, of people between her mother and her father. But they were very superstitious. And that's why she was almost kind of an outcast. She was looked upon, not only did she have this disfiguring, scars from the smallpox, but she was kind of looked upon as, sometimes a bearer of bad karma.
Right. And they couldn't grasp why she would go out into the woods to pray.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So
About 8 or 9 generations back, I had a grandmother that was an Algonquin Indian.
Did you?
I remember seeing a picture of her as a child, and she was this skinny, old, by that time, white-haired lady. She had on a straw hat and had a corncob pipe in her mouth. That's all I remember. But my great aunt couldn't find her picture, years later when we looked for it. So and that always interests me because I think my father's family was originally from New York. So that kind of makes sense that would be his lineage.
Well, there were Algonquins in Maryland too.
Mm-hmm.
Way back then. So they came all the way down the East Coast, or the eastern part of the United States. So.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Oh yeah.
Well, thank you once again, and I'll look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, very good to be with you this afternoon.
Have a great week and a great spring or fall or whatever. It's fall now.
Enjoy the
Thanks,
feast
Kevin.
day on Tuesday.
Yeah, on Tuesday. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.